The acrid stench of spent shells lingered, mixed with the raw smell of churned earth and the faint metallic tang of blood from battles that had rolled across these fields just days before. The hedgerows loomed dark and heavy, their thick branches bending under the weight of water, forming walls that hid both friend and foe. Beyond them, the enemy waited. The thought hung unspoken, pressing against every chest, suffocating in its certainty. Lewis tried to distract himself by tracing patterns in the mud with the tip of his boot, but each glance upward reminded him of the sky, gray, oppressive, unyielding. It felt as though the heavens themselves had chosen sides, casting the rain down on them in judgment. His clothes clung to him like a second skin soaked through, heavy and unforgiving. The cold seeped deep into his bones until his fingers felt stiff around his rifle. The waiting was the worst part. Time stretched in strange ways, each minute stretching into hours, each hour into an eternity. He found himself longing for the whistle of a mortar, the crash of artillery, something to break the monotony of damp silence. Fear was easier to face when it came with noise, with action, with something tangible to fight against. But here in the rain, fear crept in like the water filling his boots, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. When the order came to advance, it would mean dragging themselves out of these shallow graves and into the open. Lewis knew it. They all knew it. And yet, for now, they were prisoners of the storm, trapped in the waiting. The rain plastered his hair against his forehead, ran in rivulets down his face, slipped beneath his collar, and pooled along his spine. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to shiver, not to let the weather break him more than the bullets ever could. Hale exhaled smoke into the rain, the thin trail vanishing instantly into the mist. He looked over at Lewis and gave the faintest nod as if to say, "This is just another trial, and you'll outlast it." Lewis tried to return the gesture, but his lips barely moved. Words felt heavy in his mouth, swallowed by the damp air before they could be spoken. So they sat in silence, men of flesh and bone slowly becoming part of the earth itself, camouflaged by mud and misery. The battlefield had not yet called them forward, but it had already claimed something from each of them. The rain would not stop, not for hours, not for days. And as the horizon blurred beneath the downpour, the men knew that when the order finally came, they would rise not as dry, proud soldiers, but as ghosts already baptized in the cold mud of Normandy. The order to move forward had been delivered in a whisper, carried down the line by damp, mud-stained messengers. No speeches, no explanations, just a few clipped words passed from sergeant to corporal, from corporal to private. Huey advanced at dawn. It was as final as a judge's gavel. An. There would be no appeals, no hesitation. The weight of those words pressed heavier on the men than the rain that soaked their uniforms. Private Lewis felt his stomach clench as he heard the command. It wasn't fear alone, though fear gnawed at him like a rat. It was the realization that once daylight broke, the flimsy protection of mud and shadows would vanish. They would leave their foxholes and rise into a storm of steel waiting on the other side of the hedgerows. His heart pounded not from exertion but from certainty. The order to advance was not a choice. It was a death sentence that only some would manage to dodge. Sergeant Hale listened to the same words with the expression of a man who had heard them many times before. His jaw worked slowly as he chewed the last of his rations, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky was beginning to lighten. He didn't curse, didn't mutter, didn't complain. For Hale, orders were sacred, unbendable. You carried them out, or you didn't come back. That was all. When one of the younger soldiers dared to whisper, "What if we hold here a little longer?" Hale's voice cut through the drizzle like a blade. We move when we're told. You want to live, you move. The logic was brutal but simple. Staying behind meant being left behind. And in this war, being left behind meant being forgotten. The men understood. None of them wanted to be remembered as the one who refused to climb out of the mud when the whistle blew. As the rain thinned into mist, preparations began in silence. Magazines were checked and rechecked and rechecked. Grenades were secured, bayonets fixed with trembling hands. Each man went about the ritual as if polishing his own gravestone. Lewis's hands shook as he slid bullets into his pouch, the brass casings glinting faintly in the weak light. He imagined them already fired, already tearing into unseen enemies or into himself. The hedgerows ahead loomed like dark fortresses, their tangled walls alive with the unseen. Somewhere beyond them, machine guns waited, their barrels pointed at the very ground he would soon cross. The thought tightened his throat. He swallowed hard, tasting nothing but rain and fear. When the whistle finally shrieked, it was not a trumpet of glory. It was sharp, ugly, cutting through the damp morning like a knife. The men rose as one, bodies stiff, movements heavy from fatigue and dread. From fatigue and dread. The moment of decision had already passed in the night. Now there was only motion. Lewis felt the mud pull at his boots as he climbed out of the foxhole, his legs trembling. Ahead of him, Hale was already moving, rifle at the ready, his stride purposeful and unyielding. And into free. The younger men followed, some with curses on their lips, others whispering prayers into the mist. None of it mattered now. The advance had begun. The first few steps were the hardest. Every instinct screamed to drop back into the shallow safety of the earth, to vanish into the mud and wait for the war to pass him by. But the momentum of the squad carried him forward. To stop moving was to be trampled, to be abandoned, to die alone in a hole with no one to notice. Fool. Better to face the enemy with his brothers at his side. Gunfire split the morning almost immediately. A burst of machine gun rounds chewed through the hedgerow, sparks flying from wet branches, dirt exploding into the air. The squad hit the ground instinctively, pressing themselves into the mud, but they kept crawling forward. Every inch was earned with sweat and fear. Lewis found himself counting breaths, each inhale a reminder that he was still alive, each exhale a silent plea to remain that way a moment longer. The order had not asked whether they were ready. It had not cared if they were rested, if they were brave, if they believed in the cause. It had demanded only obedience, and so they obeyed. By the time they reached the first break in the hedgerow, 2 men were already down, their bodies motionless in the mud. Lewis didn't stop to look. He couldn't. He knew their names, their voices, the jokes they had told only hours before, but the advance allowed no pause for grief. The line moved forward, and he had to move with it. The order to advance was not just a command, it was the stripping away of humanity. It turned men into shadows moving toward gunfire, each step a surrender of self to something larger and more merciless. There was no turning back, no safe ground to retreat to. The war demanded forward motion, and the men gave it, one reluctant step at a time. The hedgerows were walls of green and shadow, thick with bramble and branches that had grown wild for centuries. To the soldiers pushing forward, they felt less like fields and more like a labyrinth designed to kill them. The ground between each wall was narrow, choked with mud, and offered no shelter once you stepped into the open. It was exactly where the enemy wanted them. Private Lewis pressed his body low, crawling on elbows and knees, his rifle scraping against the dirt. Every breath was shallow, every movement careful. Ahead of him, Sergeant Hale motioned with 2 fingers, urging the men onward. They were in the open now, and time itself had become the enemy. Each second spent exposed was another second the Germans had to sight them in. The first mortar fell with a piercing whistle. It hit the ground 30 yards away, exploding in a flash of dirt and fire. The blast threw mud into the air, raining down in clumps that smacked against helmets and backs. The shockwave rattled Lewis's teeth and left his ears ringing. Before he could catch his breath, another one came, this time closer, the concussion slamming into his chest like a hammer. Keep moving! Hale barked, his voice hoarse but steady. The sergeant didn't look back, didn't slow down. He charged toward the next hedgerow, his silhouette cutting through smoke and rain. The others followed, spurred less by courage than by the knowledge that to stop was to die. The rattle of a machine gun erupted from somewhere beyond the trees. The sound was distinct, a staccato rhythm that carved the air with terrifying precision. Bullets tore through leaves and branches, snapping wood like twigs. Men dove flat against the mud, faces pressed to the earth as rounds hissed overhead. Lewis could feel the vibrations of each burst in the soil beneath him, as though the ground itself trembled with fear. Pinned down, they returned fire. Rifles cracked, muzzle flashes bursting against the gray morning. Each shot was blind, aimed toward the flashes they glimpsed through the hedgerow. Phoo. The squad wasn't trying to kill so much as to survive, to push the enemy's head down long enough to crawl forward another few feet. Lewis fumbled for a grenade, pulling the pin with hands slick from mud and sweat. He hurled it toward the branches where the machine gun fire came. Tainta. The explosion ripped through the greenery, showering the ground with dirt and shrapnel. For a brief moment, the gun fell silent, and Hale signaled the men to surge ahead. They dashed into the open, legs pounding through muck, rifles clutched tight. Mortar rounds shrieked again, bursting behind them, throwing geysers of mud into the sky. Lewis kept his head low, eyes fixed on the dark opening of the hedgerow ahead. Each step felt like running through water, his boots heavy, his lungs burning. He didn't dare look to his left or right. He knew some of his brothers were falling, and he couldn't bear to see it. When they reached the hedge, the squad pressed against its thick, tangled roots. Hale's face was smeared with mud, his eyes sharp and unflinching. He raised his hand and pointed, silently directing them to spread out along the line. The Germans were close, too close. The sound of shouting in a foreign tongue echoed just beyond the barrier. Lewis's heart hammered as he pushed his rifle through a gap in the leaves, searching for movement. A shadow flickered. He fired, the recoil jolting his shoulder. The cry that followed was muffled but real. For the first time, he felt the weight of the fight shift from fear of dying to the certainty that he was killing. The squad unleashed a storm of fire, bullets shredding through the hedge. Another grenade went off, this time tossed from the other side, and the blast rocked Lewis backward. His ears rang, vision blurred, but Hale's grip on his shoulder steadied him. "Stay in it!" the sergeant shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The firefight stretched into minutes that felt like hours. The hedgerows became both shield and prison, their tangled branches trapping the men in a deadly stalemate. But the squad kept moving, inch by inch, crawling, firing, advancing with grim determination. By the time they finally broke through the hedge, smoke clung to the air, and bodies, both friend and foe, lay twisted in the mud. The machine gun that had pinned them down was silent now, its crew sprawled lifeless beside it. The ground they had crossed was littered with helmets, rifles, and the torn earth of fresh craters. Lewis collapsed against the roots, chest heaving, mud streaked across his face like war paint. He had survived the gauntlet of fire and steel, but survival came with a price he could not yet bring himself to count. Ahead lay another hedgerow, another field, another deadly run through mud and lead. The order to advance still hung in the air, unspoken but relentless. They were not done. Not yet. By midday, the farmhouse stood in ruin, its walls pockmarked with holes, its roof sagging under smoke and fire. The squad had fought tooth and nail to take it, and though the ground was theirs now, the price was already etched into the mud. The assault had begun with Hale leading them across a ditch, the farmhouse looming ahead like a fortress. Machine gun fire raked across the open ground, splintering wood and tearing through stone as the men dove for cover behind a half-toppled cart. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood, every breath burning in their lungs. Lewis remembered the sound of bullets cracking past his ears, the sharp whine of ricochets against stone. He pressed himself flat against the ground, feeling each thud of enemy fire ripple through the earth beneath him. Hale had shouted orders, his voice steady even as rounds snapped overhead. A flank left, push through the wall. They moved in pairs, sprinting across open ground, trading places between cover. Each dash felt endless, each pause a heartbeat of borrowed life. Grenades were hurled through windows, their explosions tearing chunks from the farmhouse walls, sending dust and plaster raining down. The Germans inside shouted frantically, their voices swallowed by the chaos of battle. Lewis kicked open a side door, his rifle raised, breath ragged. The room was dark, lit only by shafts of light through shattered shutters. Shadows flickered, slickered. He fired instinctively, the deafening crack filling the air, his target collapsing with a cry. For a moment he stood frozen, staring at the stillness of the man he had just shot. Then Hale pushed past him, barking for him to keep moving. The fighting inside was close, brutal, and fast. Men fired at point-blank range, their rifles deafening in the enclosed spaces. Bayonets clashed against rifles, boots slammed into doors, fists struck in desperation when weapons jammed. The air reeked of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. By the time silence fell, the farmhouse was theirs. But outside, the ground told a harsher story. Two men lay still in the mud, their helmets knocked loose, their eyes staring blankly into the gray sky. One of them, Corporal Jensen, had been with them since Sicily. He was the one who told jokes during the marches, who shared cigarettes when rations ran thin. Now he was motionless, his laughter erased in an instant. The squad gathered near the wall, their breaths coming in harsh gasps, faces streaked with grime. No one spoke at first. They only listened to the distant rumble of artillery, the world reminding them that this small victory was only a fragment of a larger, endless storm. Lewis crouched beside Jensen, his hand brushing the man's helmet, now cracked and caked in mud. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt useless. How do you speak to silence? How do you argue with the finality of death? He felt a hollowness in his chest, an ache that no amount of grit or duty could numb. Hale stood with his back against the farmhouse wall, his cigarette trembling faintly between his fingers. He scanned the horizon, his face unreadable. He had seen it all before, men alive 1 hour, gone the next, but even he did not pretend the loss was weightless. He simply bore it the way soldiers did, quietly with a hard stare and a clenched jaw. When rations were pulled from packs, few ate. The taste of food felt wrong in the company of the fallen. Instead, they sat in silence, the farmhouse looming behind them like a grave marker. Victory felt hollow, as if they had traded brothers for broken bricks. Lewis found himself looking at the farmhouse walls, wondering what lives had been lived there before the war. Families, meals, laughter, swept away, replaced by gunfire and blood. It struck him that the house was no longer a home, only a symbol of the war's hunger, consuming everything in its path. As dusk began to creep across the fields, Hale finally spoke. "Get ready," he said simply. His voice carried no triumph, no pride, only weariness. "Orders'll come down soon. This ain't the last stop." The men nodded, though none met each other's eyes. They knew what he meant. The farmhouse was only one marker in a line of many. Tomorrow, they would rise again, shoulder their rifles, and move toward another nameless building, another hedgerow, another patch of ground soaked in blood. For now, they stayed in silence, the weight of absence pressing against them heavier than the rifles on their backs. Lewis opened his notebook, his pencil scratching faintly against the damp paper. He did not write of victory. He wrote of Jensen. He wrote of mud, rain, and silence. He wrote because it was all he could do against the emptiness that followed the fight. The farmhouse was theirs, but it did not feel like a prize. It felt like a grave, and the war demanded they march away from it, leaving their brothers behind in the mud. That night, the sky was clear for the first time in days, stars flickering faintly above the ruins of the farmhouse. The rain had passed, leaving the field slick and heavy, the mud reflecting the dim light of the moon. The guns had fallen silent for now, replaced by the occasional crackle of burning wood and the restless shifting of men trying to find sleep in a place where sleep felt impossible. Private Lewis sat beneath a broken beam in what was left of the barn, his knees pulled up, a small notebook resting against them. The paper was damp, its edges curling, the pencil stub in his hand, worn nearly to nothing. He sharpened it with his knife, a ritual as steady as breathing, then set the blade aside. Around him, the other men were quiet, sprawled against walls or lying in the straw, their faces pale under the lantern's dim glow. He began to write. At first, the words came slow, halting. He tried to capture the chaos of the day, the sound of mortars shrieking overhead, the way bullets tore through the hedgerows, the farmhouse walls buckling under fire. He wrote about the mud, about the rain, about how every step forward felt like a wager with death. His handwriting was uneven, shaky from exhaustion, but he pressed on. Then his pencil paused, hovering over the page. He stared at the blank space and thought of Corporal Jensen. The man's helmet lying in the mud, his laughter silenced forever. Lewis wrote his name carefully, almost reverently, as though the act itself could keep him alive a little longer. He wrote about the way Jensen used to hum when they marched, the way he always seemed to have a spare cigarette. Little things, fragile things that no history book would ever care to mention. The words grew heavier as he went. He wasn't sure if he was writing for himself, for the men around him, or for someone far away who might one day find the notebook. He only knew that the story needed to be told. If he fell tomorrow, at least these pages might outlast him. The barn creaked in the wind, dust drifting from the rafters above. Somewhere outside, Hale's silhouette stood against the moonlight, a silent guard. A silent guard. The sergeant smoked his last cigarette of the day, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, as if daring it to bring another fight before dawn. Lewis wrote about Hale, too. Not the orders, not the steel in his voice, but the way he carried them, flinching, unbending, the quiet anchor in the storm. He tried to capture the nod Hale had given him in the foxhole, a gesture small enough to be missed, but large enough to steady a frightened man's heart. The pencil scratched on. He wrote about fear. Not the kind spoken of in grand speeches, but the private fear of men who prayed silently in the mud, who kissed photographs of wives and sweethearts before tucking them deep in their packs. He wrote about the silence that came after the fighting, the emptiness that weighed heavier then gunfire, heavier than gunfire. He wrote about the rain soaking through uniforms, the mud swallowing boots, the way war stripped men down to their most human selves. Now and then, his hand trembled, and the words blurred under drops that were not from the rain. He wiped at his eyes quickly, ashamed to be caught, though no one was watching. The act of writing was a kind of defiance, a way to fight back against the erasure that war demanded. When the lantern burned low, Lewis closed the notebook and slid it back into his pack, careful to keep it dry. Keep it dry. He looked around at the men sleeping, their breaths uneven, their dreams surely haunted by the same ghosts that filled his thoughts. He wondered which of them would still be here tomorrow, which names would join Jensen's in the silent roll call of memory. The night air was cold, sharp in his lungs. He tilted his head back, staring at the stars scattered across the heavens. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine home, the warm smell of bread, the sound of a familiar voice, the comfort of a bed untouched by mud or fear. Then the image faded, replaced once again by the weight of the war pressing on his chest. Lewis lay down, his rifle within arm's reach, the notebook tucked safely beside him. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new ground to cover, new names to carry. He did not know if he would live to write again. But for tonight, at least, the story had been told. In the stillness of the barn, surrounded by shadows and silence, the war felt both impossibly large and achingly small, contained within the fragile pages of a soldier's notebook, waiting to outlast the men who wrote it. When morning came, the orders would drag them forward again, toward another hedgerow, another farmhouse, another nameless stretch of mud. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, with the stars fading and the fields lying still, the men clung to the fragile truth that they were still alive. Lewis's notebook rested against his chest, its pages carrying more than his words. It carried proof that they had been here, that they had been here, that they had fought, that they had endured. The war would not remember them kindly, nor fairly. But as long as the pencil scratched and the stories were told, they would not be lost to silence.